Now, therefore, what I'm really saying is every city is basically a cultural artifact. It's the most complex, sophisticated cultural artifact we have. So one shouldn't box the cultural into some little department over here and the rest is just happening. I think, therefore, it's of all of our concern to be worried and interested in how the city works. So let's look at this a bit more closely. We all know about the great transformations that have taken place. We know the rise of the East and so on. We know the world is in motion in a variety of ways. And we know the world is a smaller place because people connect in all kinds of ways. And that religions and different worldviews come together in one place. And that we might call global culture, which is both good and bad. It's bad because it become bland and homogeneous. It's good because we can have interesting cross-fertilization. But that affects the identity of all the places we inhabit, whether it's Tainan or Hualien, and so on. But if we add this together, these transformations, you'd have to say it's like a paradigm shift, which means it changes the way we should look and need to look at the world. And it puts each of us in our own departments, whether we're national government, local government, in the private sector or not, at a crossroads. And we need to drag out, in my view at least, the old thinking about cities. So what is this? What is this old thinking really about? In essence, you could call it the City 1.0, if you like, which is basically focused on a hardware approach to thinking through how places work, large and small. Now that's not, I call this the urban engineering approach, which does not mean I do not respect engineers. Professor Lin is an engineer, and I do respect you, by the way, because things need to stand up. Of course they do. But there is more to the city than just hardware. And that more is obviously the software of a city. And as Albert Einstein said, the thinking that got you to the problems you have, or things you've achieved, will not be the thinking that gets you to where you want to be. So I think for all of us in ministries, local authority, central government, we need to have a new approach, or as we say in our English, Plan B. And so if we're looking ahead, it might be a City 2.0. Let's just say that for the moment. And the characteristic of that 2.0 is what we also could call soft urbanism, or the notion or the idea of retrofitting conviviality. Conviviality is the art of living together, how people in cities come together and do things. And this requires us to look at the city in an emotional sense. And this is where cultural people, I believe, have incredible strengths. They are the people who, in theory, understand the senses, the emotional life of citizens, their own, of people and so on. And artists, the best artists and filmmakers and so on, are obviously very good at that. So what we're talking about is here, how in the city one can bring that sensory experience back. So the pleasure of meeting, talking, and doing things together leads to, ultimately, a form of prosperity. And also embeds, let's call it for a moment, the soul back into the city, because most cities we have are increasingly losing that sense of soul. So this is really about atmospherics and how things feel rather than always just their pure function. Perhaps we should really say, as we discussed yesterday, there's a City 3.0. It doesn't really matter. I'm only using a metaphor to say that there's old thinking and that there is new thinking. And if you look at old thinking graphically, the old thinking had sort of one idea, one big company, one big distribution mechanism in order to get to households and the community. But if you think of the new way the world operates, it's completely different. There are lots of small projects. We can see it in Huashen here. There are hundreds of projects just hidden on the second, third floors, connecting in one way or another to people who are over in that next quarter there, the electronics quarter, and then beyond to the university, and then beyond down Barda Street. And this graphic image shows you much more how the world is actually working. And that requires a different view of how culture works, of how cities work, and how all of these things work together. Add to which the here and there phenomenon, and to be here and there simultaneously. So here is Amsterdam, a city which is very good at that, and this is part of a container city that has been set up for a month, and these guys here are working on their apples and just doing their job. And this is part of the pop-up culture, things that seem to be less stable, but they have their own logic. There are even, offices that can be moved, a wonderful German invention. You just can walk around with your office and take it anywhere you like. Yeah? Or here, I saw a bookshop here in Guashin which says nomad. It's that sort of thinking, this more nomadic world, which is both good and bad, as we know, because you need, of course, the stability too. And part of this is, of course, an economic logic to do with open source, where there's much more sharing, blending between things and activities in a variety of ways. And it's an economy, of course, that is more knowledge intensive and based on ideas, and where everything is about connections, connecting different things together. Now, network thinking, which is just a word, is actually incredibly important because it's a different worldview of how you operate as an individual in the world. Now, when we have government departments in cities or ministries, of course this type of operation is very difficult because these people are just connecting like this. Ministries, unfortunately I think this is true, work more in hierarchies, and that is incredibly difficult organisationally to cope with. So the question really is, looking at Taiwan as a whole in relation to all of this, because underlying this is the question of openness. So how open or how closed is Taiwan? Now, at an individual level, I think Taiwanese people, and I'm not saying this because I'm talking to you and I know you're Chinese, Richard, mainland Chinese. I'm not just praising the Taiwanese because they're all individually nice. Individually, yes, but structurally and systemically, I've heard so many examples of people saying it's been difficult to transact within Taiwan, and it's precisely these interactions that are part of the future of the Taiwanese economy and so on. So how that inside-outside works is significant. Here's just an example I saw last year of a Taiwanese calligrapher and a Japanese artist collaborating. But here's another example of this openness, which is Amsterdam, which has an expat centre, which is a place, which is a one-stop shop for any problem you may have if you are a foreigner or an outsider. So what I've really said is we need to rethink resources, which are cultural resources. All the resources in the city are cultural in one way or another. We need to rethink planning, we need to redesign placemaking, and we need to rethink governance and how things are organised as well. And basically it means getting out of the box in one way or another. So, all of this together, if we add it together, it's quite fragile. And of course I understand there's an element of instability in it. But where we are now is different from where we were. In the past, we used to plan for the known and the predictable. I will build a cultural centre. I will do this. Now we're having to think more, how do I create conditions which make cultural vitality happen? Which may not be a cultural centre. It may be your networking strategy. It may be creating interesting meetings. It may be something much more to do with software. So this is the time, or the Zeitgeist, as it's called in German, we live in. And practically every city, this is Shanghai and the Expo, is rethinking this sort of approach. whether it's small cities or big cities, and thinking how can we do this afresh. So this is London, which is using the old things it has and putting new things in it. This is their design festival. This is their craft festival, again, interestingly, in an older structure. This is New York, which is refitted the whole way. 42nd Street works, and here is the High Line, rather, which is a 3-kilometer pathway running through the city. And here you can see they're using old lofts to attract new innovators and so on. And here is Paris, and here is Berlin. So you can see all of these cities that we often use as models are doing this thinking through of how the new city works. But what you'll notice is they're using the old and the new simultaneously. So that applies to also thinking through how new public spaces work as well. This happens to be Bologna. So what I'm really saying is that you as ministries, both locally and nationally, are concerned with both culture and creativity. And creativity in this context is essentially a new currency, a form of asset. Now, places have always been created. It's only now, because there's greater competition, that we're having to be self-consciously creative and really think about it, rather than assume it just happens. Now, if we're looking at creativity, there's lots of applications of it. I don't want to discuss this in detail, but it includes thinking afresh, artistic rethinking or innovations, social innovations, and so on. But one of the main questions is, and probably people like you have been asked this many times, you've probably been asked as cultural ministries or cultural departments, what's the value of what you do? What's so important about what you do in comparison to the construction industry? The construction industry normally seems to have more power than the cultural department in general. Now, I don't answer this question anymore. I ask the question, what's the cost of not thinking about culture? What's the cost of not thinking about creativity? Because that demands that the person in the construction industry justifies why they are not, in a sense, using the type of culturally sensitive approach that you're talking about. Now, all of this requires us to rethink the rules and regulations.